What's up, guys? Dr. Seth back to help you solve your powerlifting problems. And on today's second edition of Do Not Be a Nerd, we're going to be answering the age-old question, or at least the Instagram-old question, because it wasn't really a question until nerds hopped on the gram that people started wondering, do rope pushdowns suck? What I want you guys to notice is we got this little skinny guy here doing his rope pushdowns, and even though he is a little skinny guy, he's actually got bigger arms than the vast majority of people arguing against the effectiveness of a rope pushdown. So, let's get into it. Where does the argument come from? Well, it's going to come from a force breakdown of what is going on at the top and bottom due to the nature of a rope and how we are spreading that rope apart. So in this, we got to remember that the cable is going to be pulling upwards, and because the cable is pulling upwards, it's going to be exerting an upwards force. If we go further down the chain, the rope, because we're pulling the rope apart, we're going to be spreading it. The forces of the rope are going to be at an angle relative to the cable. And the red lines, they're representing the direction and magnitude of the force that the rope imparts on the hands. I like this. This is not wrong. Now, the blue lines, they represent the forces that are created to resist the red lines. And he wants us to notice that he has two blue lines, one that goes out to the side and one that goes directly downwards. Again, that is totally okay. That is totally allowed. This is just breaking down the opposite force of this to show that we have to spread the rope as much as, and we're having to push the rope down at the same time. The spread and the push down, they're going to add up to match the force that the rope is pulling the hands up. And we think about the spread on each side of the rope. Because we're spreading the rope equally, we're not pulling to one side more than the other. These forces are going to be equal and opposite and will cancel each other out. When we look at the bottom movement is where his argument gains some strength. And what he wants us to notice is that because the rope is being pulled apart harder, we're having to spread the rope harder. So he wants us to note how much force is resisted at the bottom through outwards motion because we're spreading the rope harder. It magnifies the amount of force produced at the bottom significantly because you have to resist whatever the weight pulls the hands up, plus the force that you're resisting because the rope is pulling inwards and you have to pull outwards against it. And on the surface, this is a sound argument because with what we know about hypertrophy, we know that when we're training for hypertrophy, we want more loading in that lengthened position than we want at the shortened position. We want to challenge that stress position so that we can have the potential to create more growth. And if there is in fact more force at the bottom of the movement than the top of the movement, if there is more force in the shortened position than the lengthened position, a pushdown might not be the best exercise for hypertrophy. But I got a couple problems with this. Number one, if we're just drawing arrows and not associating any math with it, we're going to be making assumptions. We can kind of just draw the arrows to fit our narrative and make it look like something or make it look like we are assuming what something is. The other side of it is when we're considering a system of levers, i.e. the human body, what really matters isn't breaking down these forces relative to the plane of gravity and relative to the plane of the floor. What matters is breaking up to these forces relative to the plane of the ulna. So, let's get into it. Are the forces actually magnified? If we're looking at the whole system, like we talked about earlier, the horizontals, because we're pulling the rope apart equal opposite, we're not pulling it apart from one side to the other. These forces are going to cancel out. These forces are also going to cancel out. And the net force, the cable stack pulling upwards, the cable stack pulling upwards is going to be the same in both cases. And the pull downwards against the cable stack, that is also going to be the same in both cases. So when we're looking at the whole system, that magnification deal, it really doesn't appear true, but looking at the whole system isn't the big picture. What happens when we look at one rope and one arm in isolation? Because there is an increase in net force on the rope. So let's get into the numbers. And for the sake of making this easy, I just said that the force being applied by the cable is 10 newtons. It's a nice round number that made this easy to work with. So that's what we chose. As far as the angles to do the trigonometry, I got out a protractor app, laid it over the picture to calculate the angles, and this angle at the top position came out to 0.42 radians. This angle at the bottom position came out to 0.98 radians. If you want to know, if you're wondering what the fuck is a radian, Seth, well, a radian is just how I learned how to do trigonometry in Canada, and I like them. Half a circle is pi radians, so half a circle is 3.14 radians roughly. So if you want to convert radians to degrees, be my guest, have fun, but I use radians for this example because it is how my brain likes to think. So when we're figuring out when we want to figure out how much force is in the rope, top versus bottom, we got to know what we know, right? And looking at it on the surface, it might be hard to figure out what we know. But if we know that this is 10 newtons, if we know that these cancel out, and we know that these are additive, and there's two of these that should be the same, we know that the vertical component, that's going to be 5 newtons, that's going to be 5 newtons to resist the 10 newtons. That's going to be 5 newtons, that's going to be 5 newtons to resist the 10 newtons, right? Now, because we know the angle here and the angle here, we can then calculate the horizontal components. And when we're calculating the horizontal components, we got to be mindful that this angle is for the space between both ropes. But because we're looking at an isolated one hand, whoopsie daisies, one hand, one side at a time, we got to have these angles before we put it into our trigonometry doohickey or our calculator, whatever you want to call it. So when we're calculating this with trigonometry, we know that the tangent represents the opposite angle over, or the opposite side over the adjacent side relative to the angle. So if we go tan 0.21 times the 5 newtons, we get that the horizontal component here is 1.1 newtons. We know that this had 0.49, so if we go tan times 0.49 times the adjacent side, it's going to give us 2.7 newtons horizontal. We do a little bit more trigonometry. You can do Pythagorean theorem, you can do other trig ratios. I just did Pythagorean theorem. We know that the force, the net force on the top rope on each side, we got 5.1 newtons. On the bottom rope, we got 5.7 newtons. So yes, there is a force magnification on the bottom versus the top. So this argument, it's still looking pretty darn good because we do have more force at the bottom, and we would rather have more force at the top for hypertrophy purposes, right? So again, it is looking pretty solid right now. But this is still forgetting to account for the human body being a system of levers. So we're talking about levers, when we're talking about rotation about an axis, what we got to worry about is torque. Torque is basically force around an axis, or force pulling something around an axis. And when we're talking about torque, we only care about the force perpendicular to the lever. And in this example, we have this force being applied at an angle to the lever, right? So we have a force that's being applied at an angle, and when we're thinking about it, we break this force up into components, just like you did in the previous example. We have the component that is perpendicular, we have the component that is parallel. The component that is parallel is just going to be kind of pushing that wrench off of the nut, which isn't going to help us twist that nut, right? But the perpendicular component is going to be pushing that wrench down, it's going to help us turn that nut. So, if in order to figure out what this component is, again, we just got to use a little bit of trigonometry. We know that the sine ratio is opposite over hypotenuse. So if we want to figure out what this force is, we just take the sine of this angle times the hypotenuse. We're going to get this force. We multiply that force by that radius, by the lever length. That is going to give us the torque on this nut. Now, we don't really need to do this in order to be a powerlifter, but this is just kind of a basic understanding that you should at least be able to kind of appreciate and kind of make sense of, to realize that perpendicular is all that matters. We don't need to care about forces other than one's perpendicular when we're talking about lever systems in relation to spinning around the thing, right? And when it comes to the tricep, what we can think about is the tricep is a first-class lever. I mean, we got a force on one side, and we got the force on the other side of the lever, and we have the rotation point. So with the tricep's going to contract, which is going to pull the olecranon of the ulna up. It's going to rotate about the elbow joint, and in this image, we're going to be pushing against a force meter, right? In our application, we're going to be pushing against a rope as we extend the tricep. And in that rope, again, because we're only carrying with a perpendicular, what matters is the force that is perpendicular to the plane of the ulna, the force that is, I don't know, in line with this pen, as I lean back, in line with the pen, and we can kind of see how that changes as we're going. The direction that is perpendicular to my ulna changes as I'm moving because my ulna is rotating. And we got to remember that when we're thinking about what is happening to the rope and the hand in the tricep pushdown. So what does this actually mean here? We need to worry about the forces perpendicular to the plane of the ulna, not perpendicular to the plane of gravity. So let's break it down in the plane of the ulna. So we have our component that is horizontal relative to the ulna. We have a component that is vertical relative to the ulna. that are going to add up to match the force of the rope, right? So we're just breaking down this rope force into components, horizontal and vertical, relative to the ulna. Now I'm just going to move that arrow down for the sake of visualization because it's just going to be easier to picture if it is closer to everything. It's the same arrow, same shit, nothing changed. And because of Newton's third law, we know that this horizontal component, we're going to have a horizontal component that is expressed by the tricep moving the ulna, that is pushing outwards, right? And that is going to match the horizontal component here. Newton's third law again, we know that we need a vertical component because this is driving the ulna upwards. The ulna is going to have to push down. But if we go back to that wrench example, this, whoopsie daisies, this pushing the wrench down, it doesn't matter for the tricep because the tricep can't do anything about this guy. The tricep isn't doing this, so what is doing this? Well, this is driving the ulna upwards into the elbow joint, into the humerus, into the shoulder, into the scapula. And with that, it's all going to be driving back down. So it's like the humerus is just pushing the ulna back down, the scapula is pushing the humerus down, the serratus and the pec minor are pushing the scapula down. The triceps aren't contributing, so this guy does not matter to the tricep. What it does matter, though, in the case made by the poster, is that there is going to be elevated joint compression here. Yes, that is 100% true, but, big huge but, if we're worried about the joint compression of a pushdown, what the hell are we doing on a bench press? What the hell are we doing on a dip? What the hell are we doing even on like a push up? Because that compression is going to be so much higher. And in the case of the pushdown, it really doesn't matter in terms of elbow health. And if your elbow's getting banged up from pushdown, you got bigger problems than whether or not tricep pushdowns are effective. So if we're looking at the numbers, what I ended up doing, we already know that this is 5.7 newtons down here, right, from the previous math work. I took the protractor out again and I realized that, or I measured that, the angle between this and the plane of the ulna is 0.7 radians. So, a little more trigonometry tricks again. I don't know if I need to bore you going through that, but we figured out that the force that is perpendicular to the ulna down here, the force that matters to us is 3.7 newtons. The force that is parallel to the ulna is 4.4 newtons. So we don't need to worry about that 4.4 in terms of the tricep. What we need to worry about and what we need to remember is that if this is a 10 Newton cable stack, each arm, force perpendicular to the ulna, what the tricep is going to be doing to the ulna, 3.7 newtons. Now, what about at the top of the movement? We remember it's 11% net force on the net force on the rope up here. But how does that pan out? Because with the shape of the diagrams, we know that a higher ratio of that force is being acted on by the tricep because of the angles, right? And because more of this component is going to be broken down to be perpendicular to the ulna. So, taking a look at the numbers, we know that there's less force in the rope, and that was 5.1 newtons. We measured the distance between the rope and the plane of the ulna, or the angle, and that was 1.9 radians. Doing a little trigonometry magic again, we realized that the force perpendicular to the ulna is 4.8 newtons. The force parallel to the ulna that we don't need to worry about, so there's less compression here, is 1.7. We can note there's less compression, but what we really got to think about is that's 4.8. At the other side, at the other side of the movement, it was 3.7. So here, in the length position, we have a 23% increase on the force applied perpendicular to the ulna in comparison to the shortened position. So when we actually do the math and we actually see the numbers and we actually see how it pans out relative to the tricep, relative to the work that the tricep can do, relative to the work that the tricep is spinning the ulna, we can't directly say that this is better for the tricep itself, but what we can say is that the force perpendicular to the ulna, the force that matters for growing the tricep, that is going to be higher in the length position than the short position. So the whole idea that the rope pushdown is a bad exercise for tricep hypertrophy, look at the physics, look at the biomechanics, it is pretty much debunked. Now the problem with saying that is that if we are considering leverages from this point to this point relative to the work the tricep is actually doing, we got to consider olecranon size compared to where the elbow pivot is. We got to consider forearm length. We got to consider tricep size. So there is going to be some variability in that, but those limitations are going to apply to every tricep exercise. And even in the proposed example of doing the single arm variation, the single arm variation is still going to have a similar angle and it's still going to have similar limitations. So it's not like the rope is bad. The rope is good. Lots of jack dudes for many years have done rope pushdowns and they've gotten big arms. Lots of skinny dudes have done rope pushdowns and gotten bigger arms. So if you like doing rope pushdowns, keep doing them and don't worry about it. If you like doing single arm pushdowns, keep doing them. Don't worry about it. If you like doing the crossover pushdowns, keep doing them. Don't worry about it. Just do your damn pushdowns and work hard and your arms will grow. So guys, thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you got something out of this. Hopefully you were at bare minimum a little bit entertained and running these, A, to help you understand things better, to help you understand why a lot of the nitpicking major league minors you don't need to worry about, so that you can then put more effort in training and not overthink shit, because overthinking is one of the biggest reasons that I see a lot of young lifters not making progress, because they're so worried about doing what's optimal that they forget about just doing. And in presenting this way, I'm hoping to give you an idea of what my lecture style is like, to give you an idea of what to expect in the courses that I am running. And the next course offering is going to be Bridging the Gap Between Rehab and Training, where we are taking a look at how to manage athletes with injury and get them back to performance, because there is a huge gap between the release from the medical community and getting back onto the platform. And I want to show you guys how to close it. And this is going to be for you if you are a coach managing athletes, because one of the hardest parts of my job is working with coaches and trying to co-manage with coaches, because coaches have a trouble grasping how to progress exercise from, the PT room to, squat, bench, deadlift. And what I want to do with this lecture series is help the coaches understand how to get there, to give them a framework of how to get there, to give them a framework of how to meter progression, to give them an understanding of how to manage loading so their athletes will be more successful long-term when getting over injury. And if you're an athlete, not a coach, the exact same thing. I want to show you how to do this yourself, because my end goal with everything I'm doing, with the content that I'm doing, with everything I'm putting out here, is that I want to make my current job in the consulting role obsolete. I want to show you guys how to do all the shit that I can do for you, for yourselves. So links in me below. Make sure to hit it. Check out the upcoming course starting November 4th. It's going to be a 6-lecture series where we're going to get in deep on things, pain science, on biomechanics, on rehab philosophy and practice, with plenty of practical application to help you with the issues that most powerlifters see. So thank you again for watching. If you made it this far, hit those links for both my paid stuff and my free stuff to help you out. Peace out. Have a wonderful rest of your day.